G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum, and today we are picking up from part one of our walk around the town of Ypres in Belgium. And we are joined once again by my great mate, battlefield guide for Matt McLaughlin Battlefield Tours, Pete Smith. If you haven't listened to part one, go back and listen to part one before you listen to part two. Hi Pete, thanks for joining us once again as we talk about part two of the historic town of Ypres.
Hi Adam, nice to be back for part two.
Thank you, Pete. It's great to have you back. And Pete, where we finished at the Manning Gate on the first podcast, and it's a great place for us to start the walk as we start part two. So, Pete, we'll walk up the stairs on the right-hand side. And can you tell us a little bit about the ramparts and the history of the ramparts?
Okay, well, the ramparts are an integral part of the town, really. And you have to say, for most of the people that are visiting the town just for a day out or whatever, that's the bit that they're really coming to see. Even if you don't have an interest in the First World War, then the ramparts are a fantastic attribute, I suppose, of the town itself. So you can walk through about halfway around the town, I suppose, on the old ramparts. The moat itself that is below the ramparts, because the town is moated, that carries on around. And of course, in the old days, it would have linked into the canals that came in. We discussed it on part one. These canals coming into the town itself. So there's nearly all of the moat continues around the town. During the Great War, because this is what preserves, I suppose, just a fragment of the city from being absolutely devastated, and also allows the soldiers themselves to have some shelter. These earthen walls, so it's an earthen bank. If you imagine an earthen bank with an outer coating of brick, and that's really what it is. And the outer coating of brick is facing your enemy. It's facing out of the town. On the other side, we have ammunition stores, and this is in the time of Vauban, and Vauban is the builder. He's the architect that designed these fortifications, and they run right across France, of course, because at that time we are still in France in the period that he was operating in the 1680s, then and earlier. Then this would have been part of France. So these earthen banks with a coating of bricks on the outside, and then on the other side we have the powder storerooms where the men sheltered. Other munitions are stored there, and of course that's exactly what was happening in the First World War. Those shelters were reused, they were enlarged, they were sandbagged, they were steeled, there was corrugated iron, and it became the place where effectively the British Army, and for Britain in this case I'm covering the whole of the Empire, the Commonwealth, and anybody else, the French, the Belgians themselves, they are going to live in that thin strip around the town, because as the town is slowly blown to smithereens over the 4 years of the war, then this is where you can actually survive and shelter in these little cubby holes, these hiding places, these fortifications on the inside of this earthen wall that runs around the town.
There is a great example of what's beneath the ramparts. They've converted. There's a restaurant. There's a nice restaurant that you can actually eat out of, and I've actually been in there, and it's a beautiful. You actually get how thick the walls are, Pete. They're very, very thick, aren't they?
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic place to go in to have a look. There are other places that are open. I think there's a brewery on one bit of the ramparts as well. So there are other bits that you can get a dive in to have a look. But yeah, go in there for a drink. You don't have to eat. I think it's a bar as well. Go in there for a drink, and you get an idea of the complexity of what they were building at the time of Vauban, because this is a true Vauban shelter, and it's a brick vaulted roof that's quite spectacular. One of the things I have to say is slightly problematic. If you go in there and you're trying to do a lecture, and certainly with some of my groups in the past, we have eaten in there, and then I do a little talk, and everything echoes. It's very, very odd. So the acoustics difficult to actually to hear when people are talking. It echoes, but it's anyway, going off on a tangent. It's well worth going to have a look at.
Absolutely. So, Pete, we're on top of it's a beautiful park, and why don't we now start walking towards another famous gate, and what can we see as we're walking down to this other famous gate?
Yeah, so what you have to imagine, for those that haven't been, this is a tree-lined boulevard on top of the fortifications. And so it's a tarmac pathway. Occasionally it's gravel, but it's mainly tarmac. So if you've got a pram, you can go up there and push your pram and dog walk, etc. Beautiful full-size trees, lots of different types deliberately. They planted all sorts of different types over the years on top. And of course, you have to remember everything is post the First World War because it was obliterated. This could withstand a certain amount of shelling, but that brick coating on the outside blown away eventually, and the earthen bank slowly damaged by ongoing shelling. But now it's all been put back exactly as it had been. And so we've got this lovely walkway. So if we set off with the Menin Gate is now behind us, and the first thing we can see straight away is a marble monument with looking like animals around the base of it. And in fact, it's a memorial to the Indian forces that served here in Belgium during the First World War. So that's well worth going across to have a look at. 130,000 Indians served in Flanders, and 9,000 of them actually died, and you'll find them in the cemeteries around the battlefield. So that's worthwhile just stopping and having a think about it and having a look at it. And then we have almost a brand new memorial. It was inaugurated in 2015, and it's to the Gurkhas who served here, so part of the Indian Army, but specifically to the Gurkhas from Nepal. Those volunteers still come and serve in the British Army even today. And there's a new memorial there. Again, it's one of those ones that's not to everybody's taste. He's a modern Gurkha as opposed to a Gurkha in the uniform of the period. But I like it. I think it's nice that they're remembered separately, independently from the Indian soldiers. And of course, the Indian soldiers at that time would also include Pakistan. So we walk past that, and we're going to continue along, and it zigzags a little bit because the walls are actually, they're star-shaped. It's almost, if you're looking down from it, it's almost a star-shaped fort. So there's interesting bits that jut out. You can walk onto those. There's a new bridge that crosses the moat for pedestrians to get inside into the town. And we carry on, and I don't know, it's I suppose a 20-minute walk to what Adam just touched upon. The next thing that really is of interest to us, and it's the next gateway, and it's known as the Leel Gate. And like the Menin Gate, these names are named after where the roads are going to lead to. So the Menin Gate, it's because the road led to Menin. The Leel Gate, it's because the road leads to Leel. And you can walk right across. So you walk across, it's an archway. It's one of the old gates of the fortification. And we can stop above that, and we can look out. And what we're actually looking out to is a location that's famous. There's two real famous locations that the soldiers that served here always remembered, and one is Hellfire Corner. Now that's outside the town, a little bit too far for us to see, but that's on the Menin Road. And on the Leel Road, we have Shrapnel Corner. Now that is in view. We can literally, in the distance, we can see Shrapnel Corner from the top of the ramparts where the Leel Gate passes through those ramparts.
And Pete, there's some significance to the Leel Gate because there's some original Imperial Wargrave markers, isn't there? And we'll talk a little bit about the Imperial Wargraves Commission, what it was before. It's now known as the Commonwealth Wargraves Commission. So can you just tell us a little bit about those signs, please, Pete?
Now, somebody's told me something about those signs, so I'm not sure that they're original. Adam, to be truthful, it's often you pick up these flipping stories, and half the time you don't go and check. But so I'll just agree with you. These are in the style of the old cast iron signs that were all over the battlefield until the 1960s, when they were removed, and we go to the Commonwealth Wargraves rather than the Imperial Wargraves. So these are a little grouping of examples of the old Imperial Wargraves cast iron signs. Now I've got one here in my hallway in the house where we're recording this from, and I bought that in England. So somehow it had got back to England, and I bought it in England and bought it back out to France again. So a lot was scrapped, but a lot was taken as souvenirs, and they do pop up every now and then. I think the Commonwealth Wargraves in their headquarters also have some examples of them as well. But the ones under the gate, I've always told people that they were original ones. But somebody said to me, I don't think they are. I don't think they're the cast iron ones anymore. They were worried about people pinching them. So they're replicas. But I've never been up to tap them to go and have a feel to see if they're made out of fiberglass or something. So we better take it with a pinch of salt, and we'll stick to they are originals, but somebody better go and tap them at some stage. I'll do it when we get back there, and just to check if they are or not.
So, and Pete, we should also mention that we're talking, about the Leel Gate, and we're talking about the ramparts, and there was. I've heard a story that there was divisional headquarters there. Is that correct?
I mean, there were divisional, brigade, corps, all sorts at various times, depending on whether the city was or the Germans had got close to the city, it became more dangerous, or whether the Germans are further away. Perhaps one of the most interesting little stories connected with the Leel Gate is very close and underneath the Leel Gate. It's where the Ypres Times was printed. Now, if anybody knows about the Ypres Times, it's a fascinating story. It was basically a trench magazine produced by the 12th Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters, a British regiment. And they wanted to produce something to keep the men kind of happy and just... How would you keep men happy that are in the salient in that quagmire? But it was an attempt just to bring a bit of jocularity to the situation. So they produced a satirical, that's the word, satirical magazine or little newspaper, I suppose it was, using an old press that they actually found in the wreckage of the town. But it's a great story, and it was actually made into a film with Michael Palin as one of the stars in it. Michael Palin of. Right. So Monty Python, he was in, and so it's a great little story about the printing of the Ypres Times. I say 12th Battalion Sherwood Foresters. In fact, they had their press was actually destroyed by a shell, and they had to go and find another one, which they successfully did. So anyway, watch the film. Brilliant film. Started just a matter of interest for the magazine itself. It started in the February of 1916 and only went to 22 issues, and yet it was seen as really important and actually copied by lots of other battalions. They also started printing other satirical little magazines. So it's a nice little story about something that went on, I suppose, in the Ramparts. The other thing I should mention here is a very interesting little story connecting with a lady called Rose Coombs. And Rose Coombs was a historian and writer, and in the 60s, she decided that she wanted to produce a book that told the story of, the Western Front, actually, not just the salients, because she felt that it was on its way out. Nobody was interested anymore. Nobody was visiting anymore. And she titled this book that she was going to produce called Before Endeavours Fade. And the title gives a clue, because she really felt that nobody was really interested. And so she did. It's a coffee table book. If you're interested in the First World War, it's well worth buying. It's still, you can get an updated version of it. It's been updated multiple times, and well worth having a look at, because it's a photographic record of what there is to see, and that's why it needs to be updated, because over the years there's more and more things to see on the Western Front, on the battlefields. But she produced it as a labour of love, almost, thinking that nobody was going to come anymore. Any interest of warfare was really in the Second World War. The veterans were getting fewer and fewer. And almost single-handedly, she kind of relaunched battlefield touring. And of course, she really relaunched it in Ypres. And so there's a walkway that starts here at the Leel Gate and takes you around the ramparts. And it's known as the Rosie Coombs Walk, commemorating what she did for the town in bringing it back to people's attention, and hence improving the tourism in the area.
Pete, it's an interesting story, and she was a pioneer to get people back interested in battlefield tours. She was an amazing woman, and a very good story and people go out and buy that book. It's a very, very good book. And sorry, Pete. Yeah, you go.
Sorry. I also just should add that there's an interesting little quirky connection to myself. The actual photograph on the front of the updated issue of Before Endeavours Fade was taken by myself in the village that I live. It's actually a picture of Flair, and I took that photograph. So it's just an interesting connection.
Good little. There's always a connection, Pete. There's always little connections. It's good to and you've had other connections too to the War Memorial in Canberra, and it's an interesting little story. So Pete, we're at the Leel Gate, and we're going to now walk up to a another very significant and special place. We'll walk into the Ramparts Cemetery. And can you explain to us what the Ramparts Cemetery is and how there's some interesting graves in here that we must talk about?
Yeah, well, the cemetery itself is interesting in its own right because it's so very obvious as you drive into the city through the Leel Gate. It's on the left-hand side. It's clearly visible. No, it's very open. You can see the beautifully manicured lawns and the graves scattered about there. And what strikes you, even as you're driving in, is these are not the regimented straight lines that some of us get used to if you haven't visited the battlefields, that you kind of mentally have this picture of dead straight lines of graves, and these are not. These are scattered around, so it's always a clue that it's a battlefield cemetery, or it's near enough to the front line that you haven't got the ability to just put a piece of string along and bury people in nice, neat rows. You just need to bury people and to commemorate them with a marker. And so that's what this cemetery is, Ramparts Cemetery. It's got graves right the way from 1915 to 1918, he says, thinking it has, but it's certainly got them from 15, 16, 17. And it's obviously, in most cases, slightly behind the lines. The Germans never actually take the city, other than a few Germans getting into it, cavalry in 1914. So it's never taken. So this is never overrun. It's only going to be the people that were based in the city or just outside of the city that are going to be buried in there. A lot of the men are connected with the support services that you'd expect, even though this area was under direct machine gun and shell fire in 1918. But most of the people that are in the cemetery. So 198 burials buried there, 8 of which are unknown. So we have 8 unknown soldiers buried there. And yes, it was begun in the February of 1915. I just noticed, quickly scanning my notes, February of 1915 when it was begun, and closed in the April of 1918. That's the period that they were burying soldiers there. 11 Australians are buried in there, 14 New Zealanders, including 10 from Maori battalions, and we have some quite unusual, I suppose, little groupings amongst them, and perhaps the most famous are the small grouping of soldiers that were killed when the 2nd Divisional headquarters was hit in the October of 1917, 29th of October. So that's an interesting little group to go and have a look at, and they are the support staff for the 2nd Division. We also, I say, have 10 Maori soldiers, and they were killed on the 31st of December in 1917 as well. So, and they will be from one of the pioneer battalions. So it's well worth having a wander around it, and it's one of those favourite places to literally, if you've had a hectic day and you've been out onto the battlefield, or you've been doing some heavy shopping in Ypres, or whatever you've been doing, to try and find a time to go up there and to. It's got the Cross of Sacrifice has a little plinth around it and some steps, which allows you to actually go and sit down. I was thinking about it. I think there may even possibly be seats in there. Can't remember. Can you remember, Adam, if there were seats in there?
There is a seat. It's down it's down the back of the cemetery, Pete. So right down the back, there's a hedge, and there is a nice seat. Yeah, there's a little seat that's there, and I have to say, Pete, I'm a little bit biased here, but it's one of my favourite cemeteries to visit because you've got the canal next to the cemetery, so it actually backs, so the hill actually drops away into the canal, and it's a beautiful cemetery, Pete. It's one of those cemeteries that you can tell, as you've been saying, it's a battlefield cemetery, but it's got there's, as you say, Pete, there's no straight lines. There's graves going every which way, and there's beautiful trees, and when it's in the autumn over there, the leaves have fallen, and it's just a beautiful spot, Pete, to go and just contemplate the day out, as you say, on the battlefields, or the day shopping, or whatever you've done. It's just nice to go and sit and just have some time with these men.
Yeah, I agree entirely. It's a lovely place to stop. So once you have a bit of a break in there, we're going to carry on around the ramparts. Now, the interesting thing from now on is the ramparts start to decrease in size, because this is starting to get to the area where they removed the height of them when it was felt that this place was no longer needed to be fortified. I'm just going to quickly backtrack slightly and talk about Vauban. Vauban, this military engineer, He basically was determined to stop France from constantly being overrun by various enemies. So he started fortifying a lot of the towns and villages. And in fact, the town just close to where I am, Bapaume, that is a fortified. It's got part Vauban fortifications. Most of them have been destroyed. And then we have Peronne a little bit further away. That has older fortifications, but certainly Vauban would look at it, and it just goes on and on. Vauban worked all of the borders of France, really, defending France. And he's seen as such an important character that for those of you that go to Paris or have been to Paris, one of the great places to go to is to go and see Napoleon's tomb, that fantastic gilded building that he has in the Invalides. So he's got this mausoleum, I suppose, and within it, he's in the centre. But through the right, when you enter, on the right-hand side, the great and good, or seen as the great and good militaristically almost, of France are buried within that tomb as well. And on the right-hand side is Vauban. He's the first person who is buried on the right as you go through the doorway. And I think that's an indication of how important he was felt to be to France, even though he's a couple of generations before Napoleon. Bonaparte, who's buried in there. He's in there. So a very important character, Vauban.
Absolutely, and Pete, I'm glad that you did mention him because he's an important part of the story. And another place you can see as well right through is he was part of the design of fortifications around Peronne as well, wasn't he?
Yes, he is. I mean, he may have looked at Mont Saint Quentin. There's nothing left there to show what he'd done. But certainly, Peronne was a heavily defended city. It was seen as right on the frontier at one time, as was my town, Bapaume, as well. It also was seen as on the front line. In fact, they were on the front line at the time of the wars against the Spanish. So it's the Spanish had taken over great swathes of France and Holland. In fact, it's known as the Spanish Netherlands. And we won't go into that war because it's very complicated. But and I'm learning about it at the moment. So it's one of the things I'm reading up at the moment. But it's So it was Vauban was a very, very important character, and you'll see right the way to even Verdun. There are Vauban defences around Verdun, of course, famous for the fighting in the First World War. His defences are everywhere around here. I'm just trying to think of another one. Le Quinois, one of the New Zealand battlefields of the First World War, the fortifications there are also part of Vauban fortifications, a place called Le Quinois. Looks like Le Quesnoy. It's where New Zealanders fought in 1918.
And Pete, you did a podcast on that exact battle, and it's an interesting way that, as you said, Pete, that to get over into the town, they used a ladder. They used a ladder.
They did.
And it was very interesting.
They did. It was very medievalish, the fighting there that took place, the way to get into the town. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Pete, we've left the cemetery now, and we'll go to our next stop. And Pete, you walk past a couple of pillboxes. Can you tell us a little bit about these pillboxes?
Yeah, well, there are a few left on the ramparts, which gives you a clue that you don't put pillboxes on the rampart unless you feel that you're going to need them. And certainly in 1918 they did, and they were, I suppose, I'm going to use the term, the first IKEA pillboxes. These pillboxes were literally brought up in kit form. They're called Moyer pillboxes. I think that's how you pronounce it. It was Sir Ernest Moyer who had invented them. He was the Ministry of Munitions. Basically, they fought in kit form, brought up from a Royal Engineers dump, RE's dump, and basically put together on the ramparts. And they're sunk into the ground. Built right at the end of the fighting, so 25th of July 1918, and they are in preparation. Everybody knew that the Germans were coming. There was going to be this spring offensive, and so these are built when the Germans are getting close, and there is a view that the Germans are going to be knocking at the door. And a 57th Field Company, Royal Engineers, they assisted in the building of them, and the Americans were here. Americans, 105th Field Engineers also were involved in building them. So we get an American attachment to these bunkers. And inside space, about 6 feet high and 6 feet in diameter. And basically the machine gun was hung from the ceiling. It's a great concept, which meant you could spin it round and it's on a rail. so you can spin it round, and you could spin it round in any direction. So this has got basically firing apertures all the way around it. So very, very clever system. This ring inside that allowed you to swing the gun round. And they're starting to think about the men as well. With it being such a tight, small space, they were also concerned that the fumes and the gas from the gun as it's firing would render the men unconscious. They would actually, and so they did all sorts of trials to make sure there's enough airflow going through that the men wouldn't die from the fumes of the gun as they were firing. So it was well looked at. I just find it fascinating. It's one of the things that we don't talk about enough is technological advancements during the war. Just a simple thing, a pillbox, where they're really starting to think how these things should work by 1918.
It's a fascinating topic to talk about, Pete, pillboxes, because when you actually walk inside them, they, you know yourself, Pete, they are they're a small space, and yep. I take my hat off to any one of those, people, the defenders or anyone that was in a pillbox, because the noise, the concussion of, artillery hitting must have been deafening, and also, Pete, you can tell they're scattered all over the Western Front, and you can see generally. I've done it with you, Pete, and you've pointed it out, and you go, spot the difference. Can you spot the difference between the German pillboxes and the British pillboxes? And can you just tell us a little bit about the difference in the two pillboxes?
Yeah, we didn't have any, or very few. Not quite true. We did have some, but of course that's part of, I suppose, the story of the Western Front. It's one of the Germans wishing to stay and us wishing to push them back. And if we're going to be a mobile force forcing the Germans back, then we're not going to build them, because they are very static. The Germans, the exact opposite. They're here to stay. They're going to protect what they've gained, what they've taken, and they're going to build enormous fortifications if they've got the time and the will. And so that's the two conflicting, I suppose, ways of the fighting is taking place. So it means that, we are not going to build very many. We do. Don't get me wrong. We did build fortifications, but the Germans built an awful lot more, and they put a lot more time into it. And you can very clearly see that by 1918, some of their fortifications are starting to have the feel of the type of fortifications you would find on the Atlantic Wall, that wall that the Germans are going to build in the Second World War to defend Europe from invasion. Again, very technical. Well, you're starting to feel that the 1918, some of the later pattern German blockhouses are very well designed, and so well designed you could lift and move them, metaphorically, obviously, into the Atlantic Wall. So it's interesting, and we are building, I suppose, these. Again, it's showing you we are building these jury-rigged ones that can be brought in, clipped together, bolted together. It's not quite bolted, cemented together, is a better term. I'm built very quickly. So very different viewpoint on the styles. Also, you have to say that the Germans went underground an awful lot, and especially on the Somme and areas where it was chalk. And so, surprisingly for a lot of people, you don't see that many German bunkers and blockhouses in some areas. And that's because if you can go underground, then you don't really need them on the surface, because the men can shelter under the ground and come up when required. And what you tend to find then is just concrete observation posts. Now, I have to say, the first time I saw this post on the ramparts, I just presumed it was an observation post. It looked too small to me to have a gun in it, because I hadn't realised that they designed this new system where the gun hung from the ceiling. So it was a very clever innovation for blockhouses, and it shows that we're all thinking. Things are changing.
Absolutely, and Peter, it's a great point that you touch on with the technical advances. I did that. the technical advances that happened throughout that 4-year period of the Great War, and Pete, there's some great examples around Ypres itself. You've got, if people, if they want to go and see a pillbox, they can go to Polygon Wood. There's a really good pillbox there. There's one at Hill 60. They're scattered around the Ypres salient. They're scattered everywhere, and you can see them, and they're fascinating. It's an interesting part of the war, isn't it, Pete? Where you see
it is
often overlooked, Pete, as well.
It is. People forget about because they're not so obvious, I suppose, and you have to really kind of be looking for them. But when you start looking for them, you certainly do start to notice them. And perhaps the best place, if you want to go and have a rummage and look at pillboxes, is the Auburn Ridge, which is where the Battle of Fromelles took place in 1916. No pillboxes then. They hadn't really started pouring the concrete, but 1917, 18, they're pouring it like the clappers. So an awful lot to look at on that Auburn Ridge, and you could spend a couple of days just walking the Auburn Ridge. I have done, looking at the various types and styles of defensive German pillboxes there.
Yeah, and some of them, Pete, they're especially at Auburn's Ridge. There's one that actually looks like a house. It was designed like a house, and as you go past, you can see it. And anyway, we're going off on a tangent here, but
we are.
It's fine. I like it, Pete. It's giving everyone an overview of how important pillboxes were. So, Pete, we now leave Pillbox and the Ramparts, and we're heading towards the Rollway. And what can we see as we're heading to the Rollway and back around the Ramparts?
Well, the railway is in you're looking out. So you've gone past the Leel Gate, as you know. We've gone past the cemetery. We've just got to where the pillboxes are. Well, if you keep carrying looking on your left, it's on your left always, then you can see the modern railway, the modern station there. And it does look modern. It looks 1950s, 1960s, perhaps. It was older than that, as you'd expect. So built in the 1850s when the trains first came to this part of the world. And the first train actually arrived in 1854. In 1870, it was connected to the main lines, so you could then go from Poppering to the French border, but totally destroyed during the fighting in 1418. Now it actually there's only one place you can go. Really, it doesn't even. I don't think it goes to Poppering anymore. I may be wrong with on that, but certainly they've been reducing the number of places it can go to in that direction, because it is a dead end, effectively. It's not a loop. And the other direction, it goes to Kortrijk, and Kortrijk will take you to Lille and onwards to the Eurostar or wherever. So the other direction, it's very much main line. Was it destroyed in 1940? I suspect it was, because I think the design looks to me 1950s. But again, I can find nothing on the Second World War damage to the railway station. I'm sure there's something written somewhere, but I certainly couldn't find anything online, and nothing was very obvious as far as books are concerned. But I'm fairly certain it would have been damaged during 1940, or even possibly even 1944. So 1940 when the Germans arrived, and 1944 when the Polish troops arrived, because I think the town was retaken by Polish troops. Again, there is a book on that, and I need to get hold of it. So it's just worthwhile talking about. And if you're coming on the train, that's on the train to visit the town, then that's where you'll come in, just outside of the ramparts. Funny enough, it's an interesting little route if you are going on it, because it actually goes through Hill 60. That railway line on its way to Kortrijk actually passes through Hill 60 beneath Hill 60 fame and the miners and the fighting that went on Hill 60 for most of the war again.
So, Pete, we head past the railway now, and we're walking back in towards the town, and we basically can see the village, can't we? Like the village outside of Ypres itself, and we're heading back in, and we're going to head past the Commonwealth Wargraves Commission, where the office is, which you mentioned in part one, and we're going to head to a red brick building, Pete, that is designed to keep people in. Let's talk about this place.
The prison, Adam. I think that's what you're talking about. Yeah,
that's correct.
It is still a prison. So interestingly, it was a prison. It had been opened in 1873 and destroyed in the First World War. Rebuilt in 1919, and it's now a remand centre, I think, for both Kortrijk and the area. So it's quite a big area that it's actually used. Destroyed again in World War II. So it's been rebuilt. No, it hasn't been rebuilt. It was damaged in World War II. It's getting a little confused here. It was used when the prison in Kortrijk was destroyed. So that's when it becomes very busy. 48 cells it has currently. How do I know that? Well, I was looking at a little article online about the renovation of it. So it's now 48 cells. it would have had probably triple that in its heyday, but it's now reduced to 48 cells. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the prison is that there is a cemetery, which we're going to be talking about. It's called Ypres Reservoir Cemetery, just behind the prison. But for a while, that was called Prison Cemetery. And it was felt it wasn't a good name for those families, the pilgrims, as they arrived, would be wondering why their relatives were buried in Prison Cemetery. So it was changed to Ypres Reservoir Cemetery. The prison itself, it's well worth just a look at. Wouldn't look too closely. It's got cameras all over it. They'll wonder why you're staring at the walls. You may be looking to break somebody out, but it's a good remnant, I suppose, showing you how the town was rebuilt in exactly where everything it was put back at almost exactly where it had been, and previous to its destruction during the First World War.
So, Pete, you've mentioned Ypres Reservoir Cemetery, and we'll actually go into the cemetery. And who are some of the graves that we should visit in this cemetery while we're walking around this cemetery?
Okay, so let's just have a chat about the cemetery itself to start off with. So it's an original cemetery. So they were burying people here from the April of 1915, because there was an advanced dressing station within the town, and the town itself at various times wasn't as heavily shelled. It is slowly going to be flattened, but there were civilians in 1914, early 15. Civilians were still working in the town and mainly selling things to the soldiers passing through, but there was certainly commerce taking place in the town. By the time that we get into mid-1950, it was just too dangerous, and gas is the final straw, because gas the big clouds could blow over 10 kilometres, so there was a worry that the civilian population could be gassed as well, so they're removed. So advanced dressing station, and so they're burying people who die sadly whilst trying to be evacuated, and that really was there right until the October of 1918. So it was a reasonable sized cemetery at that point, but it also then became a concentration cemetery. So nearby cemeteries also within the borders of the town, and even further afield, they were shut down, and the soldiers were buried here. So how many do we have here? Well, there's 2,613 soldiers who are buried or commemorated within the confines of the cemetery. And of those, unbelievably, and it shows you that they must have been bringing in a lot of men from the outside, 1,034 are unidentified. So that's always a clue that these guys have been recovered off the battlefield, and sadly they're being recovered without their identities being discovered, so they're being brought in. Just a quick breakdown, doesn't really make any difference. 2,248 are British, 151 Canadian, 142 Australian, 28 New Zealanders, and 12 South Africans. So it's a mishmash of people across the Commonwealth. Just a couple of little stories. A very sad little grouping of men who were actually sheltering in the town, in the cloisters of St. Martin's, in the first podcast of the series of the Walking Around Ypres. We talked about St. Martin's and the fact that it was used as a shelter and was eventually abandoned as a shelter because it became too dangerous. And this was the reason, really. 16 men of the 6th Battalion, Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, killed in the cloisters when the church took a direct hit. And also 2 officers are buried there that went in to try and save them, and they were also killed, and so they're buried with the men they were trying to save. So it's a very moving little story. And then we have the story of the 2 brothers that are buried in here, and I find this moving and sad in a way. I've always found it sad. So these 2 brothers, one was killed at Fricourt here on the Somme, fighting on the 1st of July with the 10th West Yorks, a battalion that got really hammered during the attack on the 1st of July. And then his brother was killed with the Northumberland Fusiliers in the September of 1915. So he died before and was buried in this cemetery. And their father was wealthy and famous, and so obviously had some clout, and he was known as Sir James Knott. And he'd also will pour in a lot of money to have the little church of St. George's, which we're going to be talking about almost as the last place to visit as we walk around the town. And he was able to organise for his son to be exhumed from the Somme and brought here to lie with his brother. Now, I knew this story before I even came to visit the very first time many, many years ago. And so it's one of the things I wanted to go look at, thinking that these two chaps these brothers would be lying side by side, and they're not. They're close to each other, but they're not physically side by side. And I found that very sad, really, in a way. If the father, I wonder what the father felt. He put all this pressure to have his two sons buried together. And yes, they are buried together, but they're not side by side. And I just found that surprising. I thought that they would be literally side by side, but they're not. Sorry, Adam.
It's an interesting story, Pete, because as you know, it's a unique story because it wouldn't have happened very often that the brothers would have, they like this. You do see it. There's one I know of an Australian pair that are buried in Adelaide Cemetery together. There's two brothers that are buried side by side, but it's a unique story, isn't it? Because it didn't happen very often.
Well, brothers dying together, I wouldn't say it is unusual, but it's not uncommon, because horrific as it may sound, very often one brother possibly serving in the same battalion or close by would hear that his brother had been hit and was either mortally wounded or in fact dead, but he would want to go and see him. And if they'd been hit by a sniper, very often the brother went out to go and see what state his brother was in, and he would be killed by the same sniper. And there are several cases of that, of brothers being killed while trying to either locate their siblings or in fact while they were with them. So even sadder, really. But this is much more rare, and that is movement of bodies to bring soldiers together. There are a couple of other cases, but this is perhaps the most memorable and important, I suppose. And important. It's an important story because it's part of the story of the First World War, and I suppose it's part of the story of families suffering, and it also is part of the story that money does talk, because it's this is definitely a case where his money and his I suppose standing meant that an effort was made to bring these two guys together. So lots of stories, lots of things you can talk about just in that one act of burying two brothers side by side. And we also have a Brigadier General Maxwell here, Victoria Cross. A fairly famous chap during the war, and he died of wounds on the 21st of September 1917, age 46. And the VC was actually for the Boer War, not for the First World War. So he came to the First World War already having been awarded the Victoria Cross. There's a lot to talk about on him, but I won't do it in this podcast. I'll save that for another podcast.
Is Pete? Is he the highest ranking officer in that cemetery, or is there?
He is. Yes, yeah. He is. No, he's definitely the most highest ranking officer in that cemetery. And again, lots of stories. If we start talking about him and talking about stories, he's died of wounds, and we get these stories. Thankfully, a little bit gone. The lions led by donkey stories. That the senior officers never came to the front, didn't know what was going on. Well, you don't die of wounds if you're 20 kilometers behind the lines, and so it's not true. The senior officers did come to the front, and I perhaps think they shouldn't have done, but some of them did, and they wanted to know what was going on for a variety of reasons, and so they do get themselves killed.
The famous Chateau Generals, as it's
indeed, yeah.
And yeah. There's examples right across in many cemeteries of brigadier generals or higher that do die. There's one in Hermes. Yep. There's Hermes Cemetery. There's one of the youngest brigadier generals there ever was in the British Army. He's buried there. There's examples everywhere where Lucci. I can't say the cemetery, Pete. It's you know the cemetery I'm talking about.
Listen Hook.
That's the one. There's another example of a Canadian brigadier that was killed as well. So that Pete, it does shatter the myth of the Chateau Generals and the higher command not coming to the front.
Yeah, I think that myth has been broken for quite some time now, but it still is one that's hard to dispel from somebody who's perhaps not done a lot of recent reading. But the other thing I should say is that some of the senior officers that we talk about, Haig particularly, who comes in for enormous amounts of criticism still, because he didn't come to the front and he didn't. He shouldn't be. Senior officers should not be at the front because they are the guys that are planning the battles. And who's going to plan the battles if they all get themselves killed rather than having a look at what's going on? So that they're not supposed to be at the in the front line. A very good book. It's now slightly older. And I have to say I can't remember who the author is. Bloody Red Tabs is one of the earlier books that I read about senior officers, and red tabs are their staff officers. So it's really just a book on the number of staff officers and senior officers who actually were killed whilst in the front line inspecting the or whatever they're doing all sorts of things, but killed during the war by direct fire or indirect fire.
Well, it's interesting, Pete, that you mentioned that. Is Haig cops a lot of criticism for not visiting cemeteries or casualty clearing stations, or it. Pete, I know myself, and you do as well. It wouldn't be for him running he's the overall commander of the British force, and for him, I know it'd play mentally on you, seeing these. And for me, I don't think that he would have to go to the front because he knows he can read unit diaries and see that the cost of, he doesn't need to come to the front to see that he's losing men daily.
Correct, he doesn't. But you have to say that he is deliberately removed from what's going on in the front line because he's got to concentrate on if we're going to get down to the absolute truth, he's got to concentrate on winning the war. And so he has to get on with winning the war, and there's an awful lot to do, and so he can't be involved to that level. Having said that, of course, Haig very much after the war is very much involved in making sure that the disabled servicemen, are well looked after. The Haig Fund, the Poppy Fund, the poppies that we buy every remembrance. 11th of November of Remembrance Day, and in the weeks and months before when they start selling them, they were all set up by Haig. So he's an important character in looking after the veterans, because I should add how that works. The guys that were making the original poppies were disabled soldiers. So he's giving employment to soldiers to create things that will bring in more money for disabled soldiers. So it was a very clever concept and something that he developed himself. So don't just think he thought, well, that's that war finished. I won the war for the Empire and Britain. So yeah, on with my life. And so no, that wasn't the case at all. He very much looked after the welfare, or was involved in the welfare of the men being looked after.
And Pete, you should say too, and it's a little tangent that we're going off on. Really, it was thought that the war would continue in 1918. It was thought that the war would continue into 1919 and 1920. And some, Lloyd George, believed that it would go on into 1919 and 1920. So, as you're saying, Haig's got to, he's got to win a war, and he and him and Foch did an amazing job in pushing that final victory in 1918. So it's a very key point that you touch on, Pete.
Yep. I mean, it's a constant balance. You have to look at casualties against victory. And you have to say, what would have happened? What would the world look like if we hadn't been successful? If the Germans had broken through, if they had forced the Empire forces, Britain and the Empire forces, into the sea as they did in 1940, and so alternate history is something I've always been slightly interested in, but I like to try and concentrate on real history. But alternate history would very different world.
Absolutely. So, Pete, we now leave Reservoir Cemetery, and we're making our way to our final stop in the town, and we're heading to St. George's Memorial Church, built in the 1920s. And can you just tell our listeners a little bit about St. George's Memorial Church?
Well, I suppose the first thing to think about is, why is it being built? Well, it's Church of England, so it's a Protestant church, and we're in a very Catholic area. This is a Catholic area, so the churches that they're rebuilding all over the countryside are effectively all Catholic churches. Why is there a need for a Protestant church and especially a Church of England church? Well, two reasons. One is the number of men that have remained in the area after the war involved in either grave digging, perhaps exhumation work, but most importantly, the Commonwealth Wargraves. They're building all of these cemeteries everywhere. They need gardeners to look after them, and a lot of the gardeners and a lot of the people involved in the building of them, well, they are Brits that have remained, in some cases married local women, and they wanted their own church. So that's the first reason. And then the second reason, and perhaps more importantly, it's the number of pilgrims, those wives and mothers and fathers who are coming to see the graves of their son, or the memorials that their son's names are emblazoned upon, and they also need somewhere where they can, if they're religious, or just somewhere where they can sit quietly and contemplate. So it was felt that the building of St. George's was very important. And as we've already mentioned, Sir James Knott was very keen that there should be a church, and I suppose he would be, because he's going to be coming a lot. He's got 2 sons, sadly, here. And so he wants a place where he can commemorate them and pray. And so, it was built by 1929, so it's not slow in being built. And partly Sir John French, known as the Earl of Ypres for his services. He was very much part of the driving force of the Ypres League to have it built as well. So it's the great and good are involved in making sure that this thing is actually going to is going to happen. Land was given by the town, and Lord Plummer, Field Marshal Plummer, he laid the foundation stone on the 24th of July 1927. So 2 years to build it, 27, completed in 29. 24th of March. Sir Reginald Blomfield was the architect. He's one of the great and good that are working on the battlefields, and his most famous, I suppose, creation is the Menin Gate itself. But many other war memorials and cemeteries he was involved with. The church is part of the Diocese of Europe. As I say, it's a Church of England church, and in fact, a friend of mine got married there not that long ago. So it's open for weddings as well. It's classed as a Belgian national monument, so it's seen as an important building. If you go inside it is spectacular in the memorials and just everything that has been paid for inside, from the benches, the kneelers, the windows. They're all commemorating somebody or something connected to the Great War. So you can spend a good hour at least walking about, just looking and reading all the plaques and panels and things in there. It's an extraordinary place to go to if you've spent a busy day out on the battlefields, and as we've already discussed, sitting in a cemetery, and go to the church and go and have a look at the church. And of course, it has church services as well. So, if you're interested to go and have a look at one of the services that take place. Now, just recently, it's had an addition, and those are bells. It didn't ever have a proper belfry with bells. And as part of the commemorations, the centenary in 2016, then it was going to have bells put into it, and it was originally planned to have bells, but it wasn't sufficient funds to have the bells initially put in. So by September 2017, they were paid for. New bells cast in Britain, brought out. First ones of that type to be brought into Belgium, and in the January of 2018, the Bell Ringers Guild of Ypres, and they performed their first piece on the 8 new bells. So it's an extraordinary resource to have if you're interested in churches and bell ringing, well worth going to go and have a look. I have to say, because of COVID and just being busy, I don't think I've ever heard the bells ring. So I'm looking forward to when we get touring full time again to actually go and listen to those bells.
Pete, I can say I have listened to them. So when I was over there, So when I was over there in 2019 before COVID hit, it's a beautiful sound, Pete. It is it's lovely to hear them, and it's nice. It's very peaceful, and you can just enjoy the sound of the bells, and it is, Pete. When you do get a chance to listen, it is very reflective, and you do enjoy it. So yes, I have listened to them, and they're fantastic.
Brilliant.
So yes, it was lucky, Pete, just before COVID, just before that dreaded COVID in 2019. It seems so long ago that I was over there and seeing you as well, seeing you in person.
Yeah, indeed.
It was so long ago.
In real life.
Yes, in real life. Yes, not via a computer screen. But no, I look forward to getting back over there with you in September this year and walking that ground. And so, Pete, we walk out of the St. George's Memorial Church now, and as we head back into the town square and we take in the final sights, then we can sit down and, as you mentioned in part one, enjoy a beer and enjoy a meal and reflect on the war and those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. And it's something that I like doing, and I know you do as well, sitting down and having a beer and enjoying a meal and just reflecting and contemplating where you are and how significant, as you say, sometimes you've got to pinch yourself that you're actually in such a beautiful town.
I mean, it's fascinating. I can't praise it enough because it's got everything. If you're interested in any kind of history, then it has truly got everything. You've got the First World War battlefields, you've got the medieval history, the Vauban fortifications. I don't know if I mentioned it in part one, but there's a city museum now that's been it's on the end of the Cloth Hall, the military museum, the Museum of the Great War. Well, on the end of it now, it used to be part of the Lord Mayor's accommodation, I suppose. Certainly, when I lived in the city, it was where we went to. I can't remember what we did there, but it was a civic building. I forget what we went in there for. I think it was to register when we first moved into the city. But now that's been turned into a museum of the history of the town itself. So well worth going to have a look at, and something I've not been to myself yet. So it's another one of those places that I want to go and have a look at.
Yeah, I didn't, Pete. It's something that I've just learnt myself. So I look forward to seeing that when I come over in September and visit that with you. And Pete will be back on with us throughout the year, but we'll also be live with Pete when he's back doing what he loves the most, leading battlefield tours and talking to Pete actually live on the ground. So look out for that in September this year. We'll be doing that, and I look forward to getting over and seeing Pete again and doing what I love doing the most is walking those World War I battlefields and really honouring those men and women who paid the ultimate sacrifice. And Pete, I think it's a good point to finish the podcast. And thank you for coming on and telling us about the iconic town of Ypres in Belgium. So Pete Smith, thank you very much for coming on True Blue History.
Absolute pleasure, Adam. And I'm just going to add to anybody that's listening, you need to come because the town needs our support. And I need your support as well. But it's necessary to get the place up and running again. Two and a half years is a long time to be quiet.
Absolutely. And Pete, as you know as well, it's a good point that you touch on because that town really relies on the battlefield pilgrims coming over and it really, as if you get the opportunity, people, please travel and go and see this iconic town and let's get Ypres back on its feet.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you feel like supporting us, you can now via our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/True Blue History or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/True Blue History and check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more great content.